and I came across Epstein's Black Book. The Black Book contains the names and numbers of a lot of perpetrators, but it also contains the names and numbers of about 200 victims.
And you think that this ties into the Diddy case. You put Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book on the internet. Is that right?
I did indeed. In 2015, 4 years before the case broke nationally. I had written a book called The Franklin Scandal, A Story of Power Brokers, Abuse and Betrayal, about an interstate trafficking network that was essentially a carbon copy of Epstein's trafficking network. It involved hijacked grand juries, like Epstein, the cover-up involved hijacked grand juries. And I had that book published in 2009, 2010, the Franklin Scandal, and it took a lot out of me. I spent 7 years on that book, and going into a trafficking network as deep as I went, and talking to a lot of victims is pretty brutal. And I spent my own money on it. I just felt it was an important story because I have this notion, and most of the mainstream media doesn't agree with me, but I have this notion that children shouldn't be trafficked with impunity.
Yeah.
Many people in the mainstream media find that to be a strange notion, but I do have that notion. So
it does seem that way, doesn't it?
Yes, definitely. And I'll get into examples of it too. And so the book was published 2009, 2010, and then I saw what was going on in Florida with Epstein, and I suspected that he was running a network also, that he was trafficking children. At that point in 2002, I mean, this is long before just about anybody heard of him, or I should say 2012, I went down to Florida and doing my thing. I was knocking on doors and paving this, walking the streets and doing my investigative thing. And I came across Epstein's Black Book in 2012. And I came back to New York and I tried to sell that story on Epstein's Black Book. And no one wanted to touch it. No one wanted to touch it.
Can I have a quick question? When you say you came across his book, how does that happen?
Someone gave it to me.
Okay.
And the thing about it is I've been able to get a lot of documentation that I shouldn't have because I don't give away sources. So, but anyway, I did come across this Black Book, and I went to all these major magazines in New York City, and I live in New York City, and I tried to pitch them the Black Book, and no one wanted to touch it. Nobody. And then in 2012, Gawker finally published it. And then it became an internet phenom, and everybody wrote articles about it. But what is interesting is I started to call victims. The Black Book contains the names and numbers of a lot of perpetrators, but it also contains the names and numbers of about 200 victims. So I started to call victims, and they talked about being flown around. And they also talked about his island. And his island really hadn't come up at that point. Or it had very little. And at that point, I realized that Jeffrey Epstein was operating a nationwide trafficking network. And he was pandering children to very powerful people. And that was the exact same thing with the Franklin Scandal. That the true prominent pimps, Lawrence King of Omaha and Craig Spence of Washington, D.C., were flying kids all around the country. And there was also blackmail involved. And I found out that all of Epstein's homes were wired for audiovisual blackmail. And at his mansion on Fifth Avenue, he had a room that had monitors that, according to victims, people, as in plural, would monitor would look at the monitors, monitor the monitors. And when I started to uncover this stuff about Epstein, I realized that it's a lot like the Franklin Scandal. And as I said earlier, the mainstream media doesn't really seem to be concerned about the welfare of children. They were pumping out salacious dirt on Jeffrey Epstein, but no one said, hey, Jeffrey Epstein trafficked children for 25 years. We need to do something about this. this. No one said that at all in the meeting.
I have a question. Was this prior to him getting that sweetheart deal he got down in Florida? Or is this prior to that, or was after that?
It was after that. He got the sweetheart deal in 2008. How Epstein came into public consciousness was a 14-year-old girl went to her parents and confessed that she had been by Jeffrey Epstein. And the Palm Beach Police Department just viewed Epstein as a billionaire philanthropic type. So they spent a year investigating Jeffrey Epstein. And they ultimately had 5 underage victims who came forward, and they had 12 people who corroborated the underage victims. And they were going to indict Jeffrey Epstein on 5 counts of child abuse. But the Palm Beach Police Department knew of 17 other kids that Epstein had. So in all, we're talking 22 kids that Jeffrey Epstein had molested, that the Palm Beach Police Department. And there was a grand jury, and that grand jury was very, very corrupt. I don't know if your audience knows about grand juries, but they're very, very easy to corrupt. A New York Supreme Court judge once said special prosecutors of grand juries have so much power over grand juries that they could get them to indict a ham sandwich.
Right.
In the Franklin scandal, there were 2 very corrupt grand juries. Actually, 3. There was one in Washington, D.C. that there was no trafficking.
Well, you mean, I'm sorry, I want to clarify. You mean that they're corrupted, not that the actual jurors are corrupt. They're just manipulated.
Well, yeah, they're manipulated. A special prosecutor is chosen to show evidence to the grand jurors who are just regular citizens who have shown up to jury. And essentially what the special prosecutor shows them as evidence and the witnesses that he calls, those are how the grand jurors are going to make up their minds.
Right.
If a special prosecutor went in with the agenda that we're going to indict Jeffrey Epstein on 5 counts of trafficking, he would have had 5 kids come forward and tell their story on Jeffrey Epstein. But that grand jury didn't indict Jeffrey Epstein on 1 count of abuse. And the special prosecutor in Florida was very, very corrupt. It was a woman, and Bella Lovick, and she was she only called 2 victims, and one of them was 18 years old, and one of them was 16 years old at the time they were called. But one had been when she was, the 16-year-old been when she was 14, and the 18-year-old had been when she was 16 or 17. And these were kids, and the special prosecutor was calling them prostitutes. I mean, it was, those transcripts were released earlier this year. And actually, I did a podcast on the entire grand jury because I wanted to show essentially how corrupt it was.
Is that on your channel?
Yes, it's on my channel, Nick Bryant Podcast. Okay. And when the grand jury verdict was announced, Michael Ryder was the chief of the Palm Beach Police Department, and he just hit the roof because he knew, because the grand jury said that Jeffrey Epstein hadn't a single kid, and Michael Ryder was the police chief of the Palm Beach Police Department, and he's one of the unsung heroes in this story because he took a lot of heat. He was followed, and there were all kinds of intimidation tactics that were used against him. But he just exploded when that grand jury didn't come back with any abuse indictments. And then he went to the feds, and the feds were, Alexander Acosta was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida. And Michael Ryder went to Alexander Acosta, the U.S. attorney, and said, this is such a huge miscarriage of justice. It's probably the biggest miscarriage of justice that I've seen in my lifetime. The Justice Department, has to go after Jeffrey Epstein, has to indict him on child abuse. And at that point, the feds had a list of 35 victims, 35 underage victims. And they didn't indict Jeffrey Epstein on 1 count of trafficking. And according to Alexander Acosta, the U.S. attorney for the Southern District, he said that he was told to stand down from prosecuting Jeffrey Epstein because Jeffrey Epstein was intelligence and it was above his pay grade. And he's never denied saying that. So obviously, some very powerful people intervened to protect Jeffrey Epstein. A U.S. attorney can be told to stand down by two people in the government, the president and the attorney general. Now, that message can be delivered by a minion of the president or the attorney general, but it has to emanate from the highest of highs. And for the feds to cover that up was really egregious. And then the feds made this crazy deal with Jeffrey Epstein, where he was sentenced to 18 months in a county jail. He was allowed to go out during the day. And no one else that participated with him, these little girls, they were all indemnified. And ultimately, Epstein did 13 months in a county jail where he was allowed to go out during the day, and he turned his wing in kind of into the Taj Mahal, essentially. And then, I mean, I believe that he was children while he was ostensibly incarcerated, but he was certainly trafficking them after his incarceration. And that the feds intervened in 2008.
So they, when the whatever the state attorney was referring to the victims as prostitutes, I mean, he wasn't paying them to come there and have sex. Wasn't he like luring them there as like for massages and things like? He was luring them to an area where he could kind of take advantage of them, right? Like, I'm wondering why she would have referred to anybody as a prostitute.
Laura Bell Lovick was so corrupt that, I mean, her marching orders were obviously, we're going to cover this up.
Right, to quash this.
And that's what she did. And then the feds covered it up. But think about that. Here we have the most prolific trafficker ever acknowledged by law enforcement. Jeffrey Epstein trafficked children for 25 years. And both the state of Florida and the federal government covered it up. Trafficking is probably the most heinous of crimes.
Right.
And our government covered up Jeffrey Epstein's 25-year trafficking network.
So why do you think that is?
Because, and I get into this in a number of things that I've written, there was blackmail involved, definitely. Epstein's house in D.C. was wired for audiovisual blackmail, according to victims. When the Palm Beach Police Department served a search warrant on his house, they came across hidden cameras. And the island was wired for audiovisual blackmail, and his New Mexico place was probably wired for audiovisual blackmail too. And he pandered to some very powerful political people and some very powerful financial people. And if there's video footage of someone, a minor, they're owned. They're going to vote exactly how you tell them to vote. And we saw this with the Franklin scandal too. The Franklin scandal, one of the pimps was a CIA asset. And according to Alexander Acosta, Jeffrey Epstein was also a CIA asset.
That's the part I'm wondering. Do you think that that's true?
That Jeffrey Epstein was a CIA asset?
Yes.
Absolutely. Alexander Acosta was told to stand down. A U.S. attorney was told to stand down. So that has to come from the pinnacle of power. As I said earlier, the president or the attorney general. I mean, though that can be delivered by a minion of the president or the attorney general, but it was definitely either from the executive or the Department of Justice, at the apex of the executive branch or Department of Justice. So that's why I believe, one of the reasons why I believe that Jeffrey Epstein was involved in blackmail is because there's a dark, malignant corner of our government that blackmails people. And we talk about how the KGB blackmails people, the CIA blackmail people too. And the CIA continues to blackmail people.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you ever read that book? Did you ever read the book, Economic Hitman?
Yes.
Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I was going to say that whole book is about blackmailing, getting entire countries into a position where you can blackmail them, obviously with financial incentives, but it's still the same premise, and they go through extraordinary lengths to get these countries into extreme debt so they can then, have them vote their way or manipulate them.
With this, well, we knew that J. Edgar Hoover was a blackmail artist, and he was a blackmail artist for many, many years. And when I was initially cutting my teeth on the Franklin scandal, I was able to get to one of the blackmail photographers. And I was trying to understand it all. And he said, once you're compromised, it's like you're on a yacht. And it's a beautiful yacht, and it's a beautiful day. And you can have anything you want on that yacht. But if you decide to get off the yacht, the people on the yacht are going to make sure that you drown. And that's what blackmail is about. That's why no one's coming forward about being blackmailed. I can give you a couple of examples of people that were blackmailed. Larry Craig was a senator from Idaho, very conservative senator from Idaho, and he had been in Washington, D.C. for 25 years. He was initially a U.S. representative, and then he ultimately became a senator. And he had the worst record, or one of the worst records, of voting against gay rights. And he was a closeted homosexual. And I wrote a book called Confessions of a D.C. Madam, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail. And I wrote it with Henry Vincent. I
feel like I remember that book.
Had a gay escort service, and he was pandering to Larry Craig. And then there was a movie called Outrage, made by Kirby Dick, a very esteemed documentary maker, been nominated for 2 Academy Awards, where he interviews people that other escorts that Craig had sex with. So Craig is getting escorts from Henry Vincent, and he's also getting escorts from wherever he can get escorts. And he was ultimately busted in a airport bathroom. And I guess this is kind of a nomenclature that I'm not really familiar with, but in bathrooms, I guess if someone slaps their foot against the floor, that's a signal to the other person that, that they're hot to trot. So there was a vice squad that was slapping his foot on the floor, and Larry Craig propositioned him. And here's a U.S. senator propositioning a vice squad cop in a bathroom in an airport in Minneapolis. And how hard would it be to compromise a guy like that? I mean, you give a kid a smartphone and an after-school project, he could have compromised Craig.
Right.
And it's funny because I'm from Minneapolis, and I was in a bathroom in Minneapolis sitting on the commode, and then in the stall next to me, someone was slapping their foot against the floor. And I thought that they had a neurological disorder. I had no idea what they were up to. And I'm glad I didn't say, could I help you? So Larry Craig is a guy that was obviously compromised. And then Dennis Hastert was the Speaker of the House. He was according to our Constitution, he was the number 3 guy as far as power. If the president goes down, the vice president goes down, then Dennis Hastert would have been the president. And he underage boys going back many, many years. And he ultimately became Speaker of the House, and he was a strong arm specialist. He would really, really crank on people to get them to vote the way that he wanted them to vote. I'm sure that he had blackmail material too. But Hastert ultimately retired, and one of the victims of his started blackmailing him. And the FBI went after Hastert, and now Hastert decided to get off the yacht. I don't know why, but if the FBI could have gone to the person that was blackmailing Hastert and say, stop blackmailing Hastert or else we're the FBI and you're going to be in a lot of trouble. But they went after Hastert instead. And there was an FBI interpreter named Sibel Edmonds, and in lawsuit documentation, the FBI knew about Dennis Hastert going to places of ill repute in real time. So Dennis Hastert, I believe, was very compromised. And he was the number 3 guy as far as power constitutional.
So okay. So that's one example.
I just gave you 2 examples.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's okay. And you think that it's because Epstein had blackmail material on people like that he was told to stay down. Somebody who knows somebody asked a favor to ask the prosecutor to stand down. They stand down.
No, the prosecutor was ordered. The U.S. attorney was ordered to stand down.
Well, okay, yeah, ordered, right?
He ordered.
He was told, "Hey, stand down. Don't push this." But eventually, Epstein does end up with the 18 months, which is a slap on the wrist. He has to basically sleep. You get tired, you come to the jail, go to sleep for a few hours, go back home.
If you sleep hot at night, you know how disruptive that can be. Whether you're having trouble falling asleep, you're waking up sweating in the middle of the night, or all of the above. That's where GhostBed can help. As the makers of the coolest beds in the world, GhostBed is your go-to for cooling mattresses, cooling pillows, and cooling bedding. From their signature Ghost Ice fabric to patented technology that adjusts to your body's temperature, every Ghost Bed mattress is designed with cooling in mind. So whether you want a plusher mattress that cushions your shoulders and hips, or a firm option with exceptional support, your Ghost Bed will keep you cool and comfortable all night long. When you purchase a Ghost Bed mattress, your comfort is guaranteed. You can try out your mattress for 101 nights, risk-free, to make sure it's the right fit for you. Plus, they offer free shipping, and most items are shipped within 24 hours. If you're not sure which Ghost Bed is right for you, check out their mattress quiz. You'll answer a few questions and get a personalized recommendation. Even better, our listeners can get 50% off site-wide for a limited time. Just visit ghostbed.com/Cox and use the code COX at checkout. Again, that's ghostbed.com/Cox with the code COX at the checkout to save a whopping 50% off site-wide.
For 18 months. And then, so that doesn't really curb his appetite at all. He continues after that.
Well, he continues. I think his addiction becomes much more intense, but then he's also trafficking these girls too. There's a U.S. congressman named Tim Burchett from Tennessee, and I had him on my podcast, and he has talked quite openly that many of his colleagues in Congress are compromised to honey traps. Honey traps are not something that is new. I mean, political blackmail is as old as politics. I'll give you an example of people think their founding fathers were saints, and what they did was quite amazing, but they had their foibles. Alexander Hamilton was having an affair with a 23-year-old woman who was married, and her husband was blackmailing Alexander Hamilton. And there was a muckraking journalist who outed Alexander Hamilton and this affair, and he felt, and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton really had a tremendous amount of antipathy towards each other. So when Thomas Jefferson became president, this muckraker felt like Jefferson would give him a position in the administration because he outed Hamilton. And he didn't. So the muckraker outed Jefferson on having an affair with one of his slaves named Sally Hemings. And actually, DNA has corroborated that.
Right.
So political blackmail is been with the United States as long as the United States has existed.
Okay, well then, so at one point though, Epstein does get indicted.
What happened with Epstein was, and this happened with Craig Spence, and I also believe it happened with Diddy. If you're a blackmailer, you cannot receive a lot of media attention because that's going to end your gig as a blackmailer. one of the pimps in the Franklin scandal had a lot of stories written about him, and he ultimately killed himself. Now, people on the internet think that he was suicided. I don't believe that. I believe that he killed himself, but I also believe that he was probably told either you're going to kill yourself or we're going to kill you. Take your choice. And with Epstein, there were articles coming out from the Miami Herald. They did a series on him. So his ability to be a blackmailer was completely disrupted. And there was just too much media on him. And I believe that that's why he was taken down, why he was arrested.
Okay. What do you think? So what happened with with his untimely demise? How do you call it? What did you say? He was suicided?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are so many anomalies that occurred in that prison that night. The guards were sleeping, and one of them wasn't really a guard. His cellmate had been taken out. The cameras weren't working. I believe that Jeffrey Epstein, well, I mean, obviously, either he killed himself or someone helped him. But here's the thing about that. Everybody, it's kind of like a red herring. Everybody focuses on whether or not Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. But no one focuses, and our media is certainly guilty of this, no one focuses on Jeffrey Epstein trafficked underage girls for 25 years. No one focuses on that. I've read a lot of Jeffrey Epstein articles, and I've written some Jeffrey Epstein articles, and I've noticed that about our mainstream media is no one is taking the mainstream media to task for the grave injustices that were covered up by the Justice Department. And I believe that there are people in the media that are blackmailed. Media personalities are as susceptible to blackmail, I think, as politicians. But with politicians, you're dealing with alpha males. They're highly sexed. They're arrogant. And nothing makes people stupid like sex and arrogance. Those two things. And then when you combine them, there's a very powerful synergy that makes people really stupid and makes them highly susceptible to blackmail.
Well, I mean, I think that people are probably focusing on the fact that he potentially was, I don't know what you say, killed or assassinated, whatever you want to call it, murdered. So I think that people are focusing on that because, once again, that shows that somebody in the government, because it would have taken someone with an extreme amount of power to pull that off. So I think they focus on that because maybe they're thinking that's like I don't know, is there a smoking gun somewhere?
I can tell you why that's being focused on. Because the mainstream media is focused on that. The mainstream media has not focused on justice for all those victims. The mainstream media is just focused on whether or not Epstein killed himself. That's the sad truth about it all. I mean, the mainstream media was good at kicking out salacious articles about Bill Gates. And actually, I believe that reportage about Bill Gates was probably wrong, too. According to the mainstream media, Jeffrey Epstein met Bill Gates in 2011. But I've got an article from the Evening Standard, the UK's Evening Standard, that says that they were doing business in the 1990s. This is before. This article is from 2001. And it also talks about Jeffrey Epstein's intelligence connections. Our media was very shoddy when it was reporting on Jeffrey Epstein and his crimes. When you think about, like when I got the Black Book, there were, 200 victims in it, but there were a lot more victims. And there were victims in California. There were victims in New Mexico. There were victims in New York. There were victims in London. There were victims in Paris. Jeffrey Epstein's pedophile network was, intercontinental. So all these kids were destroyed. And what the media doesn't convey which is really a shame, is that human traffickers are vicious people. And the media has made Epstein and Maxwell out to be not nice, but certainly not as vicious as they actually were. There have been a couple of books written by Epstein survivors, and we've got lawsuit documentation. And Epstein and Maxwell were vicious people, vicious. And the media really hasn't reported on that either, which is really another sad thing that that's been neglected in the Epstein case.
So you feel like this ties into the Diddy case?
Well, okay, so I wrote a book called The Franklin Scandal.
Right.
Story of Power Brokers should be some betrayal. And Epstein was essentially a carbon copy of that. I believe that the Franklin network was bigger than the Epstein network, but it was only around about 11 or 12 years, whereas Epstein trafficked kids for, I think, probably about 25 years. And what you've got with Diddy is something very similar. We know that all of Diddy's homes were wired for audiovisual blackmail too, and that he recorded his free bus. That has been corroborated by multiple people. And the thing with Diddy was he'd been a thug and a rapist for years. But there were, when the feds took him down, there were, I believe, at least 5 lawsuits that have been launched at him.
Right.
It might have been as high as 8. And 2 of those lawsuits were minors. They'd been minors when they had allegedly been by Diddy. And then Little Rod, a hip hop producer, came forward and said that Diddy was constantly trafficking children. And here's the connection between those two. There was a U.S. attorney named Damian Williams, and he was a U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Manhattan or New York, which generally makes him the most powerful federal law enforcement officer in New York City. And he was the guy that carefully choreographed Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. There were 4 victims that were called in Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, and those 4 victims had only been by Epstein and Maxwell. They didn't know of all the other power brokers because they had been their abuse had been somewhat insular. Damian Williams is also the U.S. attorney that oversaw the grand jury that indicted P. Diddy. And here's a fun fact. Both Maxwell was indicted on conspiracy and Diddy was indicted on conspiracy, but no one else was indicted. I mean, how can you be indicted on conspiracy when nobody else is indicted? So Damian Williams really covered up a number of the people that were involved with Diddy, and he also covered up Diddy's trafficking. And a nasty piece of work. Here is what we should be focusing on. Jeffrey Epstein's safe was drilled, and the FBI confiscated hundreds, if not thousands, of DVDs. And I think a lot of them were porn, but I think a lot of them were compromised DVDs. Why haven't we heard about that? Why has no one reported that? They seem to have been put in a black hole. When Epstein died, the Justice Department said that the case was closed. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act, and I didn't want the DVDs. I wanted reports on the DVDs. And then the FBI told me that the case was ongoing. So, but if people really wanted to focus on something, they should be focusing on those DVDs that were impounded from Jeffrey Epstein's Manhattan home.
Right. So real quick, where is the black book still up that you put up?
Yeah, it's all over now.
Oh, it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's all you got to do is type in Jeffrey Epstein Black Book, and it'll come up. And the rendition that I put up there, we black out the numbers of everyone. But
the phone numbers?
Yeah. But now there's versions of it that are unredacted.
Okay.
And and very few publications have given me credit for putting the Black Book on the internet. And I find that somewhat fascinating because tons of ink have been spilt on that Black Book. Tons of ink have been spilled on that Black Book. And only one publication mentioned my name, and another publication actually ran a story about me putting the Black Book on the internet. But other than that, mum's the word about Nick Bryant and the Black Book. How the Black Book got ushered into public consciousness was Alfredo Rodriguez was a house manager for Jeffrey Epstein. And he purloined the Black Book in 2005, 2006. And when attorneys started launching lawsuits at Jeffrey Epstein, he tried to sell the Black Book to one of the attorneys. And the attorney called the FBI, and the FBI did a sting and got a hold of the Black Book. And Rodriguez said that he circled people that were in cahoots with Jeffrey Epstein. And there were a number, and then there are people with numerous contact numbers. Alan Dershowitz is circled, and he has numerous contact numbers. Bill Clinton isn't circled, but Epstein had 25 contact numbers for Bill Clinton. The former Senate Majority Leader, George Mitchell, I believe that either he's circled or there are multiple numbers for him, but one of the victims have come forward and said that he her as a minor. Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, is circled. And he actually was living in the apartment building, or stayed in the apartment building where Jeffrey Epstein put his victims. And one victim has come out and said that she'd been molested by Ehud Barak.
Okay. What about? Oh, okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
And Ehud Barak was the prime minister of Israel. And this theme is repeated with the Franklin scandal. Is there were people at the pinnacle of power that were being pandered to by King and Spence, and that's one of the reasons why I could not get that book published. It took me. Everybody rejected that book. I mean, I had two agents try to sell it, or one maybe just look at the book proposal, and one tried to sell it. But no one would touch it because they thought that these people were they just had too much to lose by children. And we found out with Epstein that is not the case. That
doesn't mean anything. Yeah.
These guys will take incredible risks.
Yeah. I was going to say when you're addicted, when it's an addiction, you toss, caution to the wind, right? Like, how many super powerful or rich people are alcoholics or doing some kind of drugs, or, they have issues. So you tend to, plus you also get to that, I think, that status, and you begin to feel invincible, that the money will insulate you in some way. So you take some people take all kinds of risks.
Leon Black, who's a billionaire, inexplicably paid Jeffrey Epstein $150 million. Why did...
No reason at all?
No.
For no reason at all? Just...
So here's the reason that was offered by the mainstream media, which is unbelievably disingenuous. It said that Jeffrey Epstein helped him save money on taxes. That's right. Leon Black gave Jeffrey Epstein $150 million. And in 1987, Les Wexner, another billionaire, gave Jeffrey Epstein power of attorney over all his money, where Epstein could do whatever he wanted with any of Les Wexner's money. And Les Wexner was the founder and CEO of L-Brands at that point, which owned Victoria's Secret and Tommy Hilfiger, a number of clothing lines. So Les Wexner gives Jeffrey Epstein power of attorney over every single dollar that he has. And the media, and I can't believe this. I mean, you talk about disingenuous. The media, it was either the New York Times or Vanity Fair, I'm leaning towards the New York Times, said that the reason why Les Wexner did that was because he was lonely. He gave Jeffrey Epstein power of attorney over billions of dollars because he was lonely. I mean, if you believe that, there's a bridge in Brooklyn that I can give you a very good deal.
Well, there are, for $1 billion, you can buy a lot of company. You don't have to sign it over to anybody.
But why would a major media outlet say something so stupid? I mean, so it's very obvious that these media outlets went into cover-up mode too. And there was the Jeffrey Epstein Victims Compensation Fund, which has been horrible. 225 women have come forward. 150 have been offered settlements, and 8 have declined settlements. So money has been given to 142 of Jeffrey Epstein victims. And if you get money from that fund, you've got to sign an NDA saying that you're not going to sue anybody else. So that fund is silencing victims that the government couldn't silence. And it was put together by Jordana Feldman and David Boies, who also represents one of the attorneys. And as soon as David Boies started representing Epstein victims, he conscripted a guy named Stan Pottinger. And Stan Pottinger was an associate attorney general who covered up all kinds of stuff. And then after he was done covering stuff up, he decided, well, I'm going to be a criminal now and make a lot more money. And he was, during the Iran-Contra affair, he was busted talking to Iranians on how they can import weapons without any red flags. And there was a recording of that, of Stan Pottinger talking to these Iranians. And Rudolph Giuliani was in charge of the case. And the reason the Iranians went down and went to prison, but the reason why Stan Pottinger didn't go to prison was because, according to the Department of Justice, the Justice Department lost the tape that had Stan Pottinger on. Lost. I mean, they couldn't have given us something a little more solid than just losing the tape. And this is the guy that David Boies conscripts to help him. So I believe that the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund is an intelligence operation covering up for an intelligence operation. And the narrative, we do not know why some women are given settlements and some aren't. But I know of 2 therapists, and one's a psychologist, and actually she's a very esteemed psychologist, who believes absolutely that one of the women that she counsels was trafficked by Epstein when she was under 10 years old. And she was denied money from the fund. And then I know another therapist who counsels someone, and this therapist believes that this woman had been trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein when she was under 10 years old. So there's 2 accounts of that, and both of them applied for compensation, and the victim compensation fund wouldn't give them a dime because they didn't fit into the narrative. The narrative is that there weren't victims younger than 14. That's how dirty the victim compensation fund is.
Well, are they to be able to apply and be granted, some kind of relief from the fund? Like, are they having to prove anything, or they just okay? So they have to prove that, hey, I've been to the house, I was contacted by them. Something, there has to be some kind of proof. You can't just say it.
The first kid that I mentioned, or the first person that I mentioned, was under 10. She described the interior of Jeffrey Epstein's house in New York, and she knew all kinds of stuff about that neighborhood. And she did not grow up in that neighborhood. And the psychologist really believes her. And as I said earlier, the psychologist that counsels her is one of the most esteemed psychologists in the United States, especially when it comes to working with abuse or trauma survivors. So that is the Victims' Compensation Fund. It's just another cover up. And what's really, really egregious is that if someone, as I said earlier, if someone gets money from that compensation fund, then that's it. They sign an NDA. They can't sue anybody else. And that's really horrible, because victims of sexual abuse heal by talking about their abuse. I mean, that's how they heal. Because I've written a lot about trafficking, I've gotten to know, and actually I've spoken at some very large trafficking conferences. The National Center on Sexual Exploitation has an international summit. Every year I've spoken at 3 of those summits, and the International Society for the Study in Trauma and Dissociation, I've spoken at one of their international meetings, and I've also spoken at a seminar that they've put on. So I've got a lot, over the years, I've learned a lot about trafficking and what trafficking victims, the kind of abuse that they endure. And it's really a tragedy that these women sign these NDAs, because it's ultimately going to affect their healing.
I'm back to the list, of course. I'm back to the list, which is what you're saying doesn't exist, but that's fine. I mean, that actually would make a lot of sense. That's why it's never being released. That's why I don't know whether it seems like there would be some kind of something. But
I mean, look up have your audience Google the Epstein Black Book, and you'll see all the people that are in that Black Book. Now, not all of them are compromised pedophiles, but a lot of them are ones that are.
I'm wondering. I'm about the list. I'm wondering, is this a list that the list that's always being referenced? This may be a list of simply that the government has come up with. Hey, this is the list of the people that we think were involved in this. Maybe it's not, because they have to have had some kind of list. So it doesn't necessarily mean. The more I think about it, doesn't necessarily mean there's a list that Epstein was keeping. It could have simply been a list that the government came up with to say, hey, these are people that we believe participated, and that list, may exist, and they just never released it. I'm wondering, and it is very odd.
That's an entirely plausible scenario. But when people talk about the list, they're talking about Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein's list.
And you're saying that you don't think that even exists. That's
the closest we come is the Black Book. But what people should be focused on is all these DVDs that the FBI impounded that seemingly went into a black hole. If you're going to get names of perpetrators, they're definitely going to be on those reports that the FBI about those DVDs.
It's the same thing with these the Diddy. The government had they confiscated or whatever, collected, or in their raids, all of this equipment on Diddy, and they got a bunch of tapes. They've never admitted that they really have, that there's anything on these tapes. It's circulating that there are children. It's circulating that there's all this stuff, but the government's never come forward and said, hey, we have video of these events.
Actually, there is someone from Homeland Security.
And they've said that there's actual video of underage.
Not of underage, but there's clandestine videotape that was impounded. It was.
Well, a clandestine could mean anything. Does that mean it's them having sex?
People, yeah. I mean, not knowing that they were being recorded. That there were all kinds of cameras. And it was Homeland Security that raided Diddy's home in LA and also Miami.
Right.
Generally, that is done by the FBI of interstate child trafficking or human trafficking. But the Homeland Security does have a branch that deals with human trafficking, but that search warrant emanated from the Southern District of New York, Damian Williams, who I talked about covering up both Epstein and Maxwell and also covering up Diddy. Why would the search warrant emanate from the Southern District of New York when the searches went in LA on Diddy's LA homes and then also on his Miami home? You'd think that they would come from the District of Southern California. And that is additional proof that Damian Williams is very corrupt. And he wanted to make sure that the Southern District did damage control on Diddy. And the fact that Diddy was indicted on a conspiracy and no one else was indicted is just further evidence that this is a huge cover-up.
Well, I think so that I understand. It's funny because that's a little slightly difficult concept to understand, where most people would be like, well, that doesn't make sense. He's going to indict him and then cover it up. Just why not indict him? Because the truth is he's about to be indicted by somebody. Like somebody's going to indict him. If he's going to be indicted, I want to be able to be the person indicting him so that I can run kind of interference for whoever is involved in this whole thing, so we can do damage control for those people. So that it does make sense, but the concept's a little bit, most people aren't going to make that leap. They're going to be like, that doesn't make sense, but it does make sense.
Exactly. And Damian Williams has shown that he's willing to do the bidding of very, very corrupt people. And he's a very corrupt individual himself. He resigned from the Southern District, being a U.S. attorney for the Southern District a couple of weeks ago. His job is done. Now it's going to be passed to someone else who's equally corrupt as him to cover up the rest of the Diddy scandal. And again, Diddy was getting a lot of press attention because of these lawsuits that have been launched at him. I think by March, there was probably 8. And the media was reporting on them. And as I said, with Spence and the Franklin scandal and Epstein and also Diddy, if you're a blackmailer, you're not going to be very successful at your job if people know that you've got hidden cameras. And those lawsuits definitely mention the hidden cameras. And plus, P. Diddy he started Bad Boy Records with Clive Davis in 1993. And Clive Davis, there was a documentary about him as being a benign octogenarian and helping all these people in their careers. Clive Davis is a criminal, a big-time criminal. And he's been indicted for not defrauding the IRS once, or charged not once, not twice, but 3 times. He's been charged with defrauding the IRS. He was also involved in the biggest payola scandal of all time. And that's when record companies give money to DJs or radio stations.
Right.
And there was a Genovese guy named Pasquale Falcone who was busted smuggling a lot of into the United States of America. And the feds started drilling into Pasquale Falcone, and they noticed that he and Clive Davis had set up a bunch of shell companies. And Clive Davis was head of ABC Records at that point. And Clive Davis was sliding money into these shell companies. And his father was a dealer and also in the Genovese crime family. And you want to know how much time Clive Davis did for all that criminality?
20, 30 years?
He didn't do one day in jail.
No. That's crazy.
He had a much better deal than you did.
Yeah.
And,
I didn't know the right people. You got to know the right people.
And I'm sure that his criminality exceeded yours by far. But
That's true.
And so the only way that a person can not spend a day in jail with that degree of criminality as if he's working with the government. That's so I think that Clive Davis took Diddy by the hand and they walked down the yellow brick road together. And that's where I think Diddy got his protection, started being his protection for all of his criminality. And The molestation, I think there is over 120 sexual assault lawsuits against him, and a lot of them have been minors. He's been doing that all these years, and he's just good. But again, those lawsuits started coming, and he started getting media, and then it was time to take him down.
So I want to kind of touch on you've got a book that recently came out about Watergate, and it's funny because, oh gosh, I had a guy on here a few months ago, and I mentioned Watergate, and I kind of gave him the quick rundown of what had happened, and he looked across the table from me, and he goes, "That's not right at all." I was like, "What?" So I had the kind of the version that I had, and listen, I wasn't that far off, but I was further off than I certainly thought I was. I really felt like I thought Nixon was kind of in the know the entire time and kind of dictating the whole thing. I also thought that when the burglars went into the Watergate hotel, that it was the first time they were going in to actually bug for the first time, when in fact I found out as we talked that no, the burglars were removing the wires. And I was like, okay, I didn't know that at all. Like I had it completely off.
Actually, still have it wrong.
Really? Still?
My book on Watergate contains 2,328 citations, I believe. I combed through thousands of pages. I spent a long time on that book. But Watergate is very complex. It's a conspiracy within a conspiracy. So it's a very complex tale. And people that have written, a number of people have written great books on Watergate, but they've made them so convoluted that the books have to be studied. They can't be read. What happened with Nixon is he had been a Cold Warrior and a very staunch anti-communist. And when he was elected, and he ran in 1960 against John Kennedy, and he was beat. But then he ran in 1968, and he was talking about extending olive branches to both the Russians and also the Chinese. He had realized before, our foreign policy had been one of containment. And that's why we were in Vietnam. We were going to contain communism in Vietnam. And we had done that in South America. And we'd also done that in other parts of the world. And he realized that containment wasn't working. It was just very expensive. So when he was elected president, I think on his second day, he issued National Security Memorandum 2, I believe it was called. And basically what he said was the CIA, the Pentagon, and the State Department will have no bearing on my geopolitical moves. So basically, because they were all hawks. So basically he was telling the hawks in the CIA and the Pentagon and the State Department to go to hell. And then he started doing clandestine negotiations with the Chinese and also with the Russians. And with the Chinese, he opened up China for diplomatic relations. We hadn't had diplomatic relations with the Chinese since it had become communist. And then he told the Russians, because he really wanted to reduce nuclear weapons, and he told the Russians that he was willing to give up Vietnam if they were willing to start negotiating about nuclear weapons. As I said, he was doing this in secret because he knew that the hawks would be so much against him. And actually, the Joint Chiefs of Staff started an espionage ring against Nixon. I mean, it's called the Moore Radford affair. It's been cited innumerable times. But the Joint Chiefs wanted to know exactly what Nixon was doing with the communists. So they had this espionage ring that was there for about 3 years before the Nixon administration outed it. And after the Nixon administration outed the espionage ring, then the CIA started infiltrating the Nixon administration. And all those guys that broke into the Watergate were CIA.
Right.
Except for G. Gordon Liddy. They were all CIA guys, and they broke it. And you're correct; they did break in twice. But according to James McCord, who was ostensibly retired from the CIA, and he was one of the burglars, the bug wasn't working properly, or they planned two bugs, and one of them wasn't working properly. So G. Gordon Liddy, who was, I had to hate the word, use this word again, was ostensibly head of the plumbers. He had McCord go in a second time. And here is the conspiracy within a conspiracy. The CIA guys worked very hard to get busted. The first time, they really wanted to get busted. They signed in to the Watergate at about midnight, and they signed into the Federal Reserve Board, which was on the 8th floor of the Watergate, and the Democratic National Committee was on the 6th floor. But the Federal Reserve had been burgled a month before, so there was intensified security on the Federal Reserve, and they signed at midnight. You've got a bunch of guys signing in. And the security guard had the IQ of like an avocado.
Right.
He couldn't put it together. So the second time they went in, one of McCord's Confederates, Alfred Baldwin, called the DC. There was an intelligence guy in the DC police named Carl Schaffler, told the DC police that there was going to be a break-in in the Watergates, and Schaffler was improbably parked with two other police officers, and probably parked a couple of blocks away from the Watergate that night, and he shouldn't even been in Washington D.C. So that is one of the conspiracies that was perpetrated with Watergate. Is the CIA really wanted to take down Nixon, and they alerted the Washington Police Department. But the Watergate was also tied to a CIA honey trap. There was a madam named Heidi Reichen, and she ran a CIA honey trap in the Columbia Plaza Apartments, which is about a block away from the Watergate. And if you went to the Democratic National Committee and you were a big shot, you would go to a secretary and ask her for like an album or a collection of pictures, but there would be pictures of all the prostitutes that were working at the Columbia Plaza. This is way pre-internet. So it was kind of hands-on. So you look at the prostitute that you'd want, and then the Columbia Plaza would be called, and you would get the prostitute. And then you would also ultimately be compromised by the CIA because they had hidden cameras in that brothel. When the burglars got busted, one of them had the key to the drawer where the pictures were kept, and their photographic equipment was on top of that secretary's desk. So there's two conspiracies going on within Watergate. That's what makes it so unbelievably complex.
Okay. Well, why is the CIA conducting any type of operations within the United States? I mean,
that's not them before. You've got
it's what?
You've got chaos. You've got the CIA has operated domestically for years. And
right, but isn't that against their charter? I mean,
it's absolutely against their charter, but that doesn't stop them. And I believe, going back to the blackmail, I believe that there is a dark malignant corner of our intelligence that blackmails people. That's why they have that power. That's why that's how they can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. I mean, they have so much power that they can basically do whatever they want.
Well, so how thick is your book? I mean, tell me you didn't if you got that many citations, what is this thing? Is this like,
It is not. My book is not a tome. These other Watergate books are tomes. I tried to keep Watergate as simple as possible. Every sentence has it. That the reason why there's so many citations is because every sentence has a citation.
Okay.
And the citations are either from government documentation or books or magazine articles. So most of it was mainstream stuff that I was able to triangulate. But the book is only 220 pages. My goal in writing this Watergate book, I'd written 2 previous books about CIA blackmail operations, the Franklin scandal, Confessions of a DC Madam, and then this one. And this is what got me in. When I started to look into CIA honey traps, that's what led me to Watergate. And I also show that the famed reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, are pathological liars. And the head of the Washington Post is also a CIA asset. And Woodward is definitely an intelligence asset for sure. And I really demonstrate that in the book. So the CIA really wanted to get rid of Nixon. They set up that botched burglary. And then the Washington Post went after him with CIA assets. Well, Carl Bernstein wasn't a CIA asset, I don't think. He just wanted money for nothing and chicks for free, as the Dire Straits would say.
Okay. So was there an actual Deep Throat?
Deep Throat is a composite.
Oh, okay.
But the most damaging information that was given to Woodward came from Alexander Haig, who was Nixon's chief of staff. Alexander Haig hated Nixon, but he was a shapeshifter, and he was able to become Nixon's former chief of staff. When the Watergate episode started to explode on him, he resigned. And Haig, who had worked for the National Security Council, and actually Nixon, he started out as a colonel, and Nixon made him a general. He was the guy that was giving really damaging information to Bob Woodward. Mark Felt was, I mean, that's such bullshit. Mark Felt wasn't even employed by the FBI when the most damaging information was coming out from Deep Throat. He had been fired by the FBI and he was living in Virginia. Now, according to Bob Woodward, he would move his flower pot on his balcony if he wanted to talk to Deep Throat. And Deep Throat would walk by his apartment or drive by his apartment and look at his balcony. So we're supposed to believe that Mark Felt had been fired from the FBI 6 months earlier, and he's driving into Washington, D.C. every day and looking at Woodward's balcony for a flower pot. But here's the thing with that. The Woodward's apartment was facing a courtyard. So for someone to look at Woodward's balcony, you would have to drive into an alley and get out of your car and walk about 50 feet and look straight up. And that's the story that they sold to us. When they went a bridge too far, and when I say they, I say Bob Woodward and his Confederates went a bridge too far when they named Mark Felt, who had a serious case of Alzheimer's as Deep Throat. And I don't think that Mark Felt probably remembered what Watergate was. And then Woodward said if Deep Throat wanted to contact him, he would put a clock on a certain page of the New York Times. And then the New York Times would be delivered to his apartment with the clock on. It was like page 20 or something like that. And the clock delineated what time they were going to meet. And this, I mean, talk about incompetence with the mainstream media. All the newspapers that went into this apartment building were dumped in the lobby. There was a pile of them in the lobby. And then you had to get the newspaper by going down to the lobby and picking it up. So there's no way that system was even feasible because of how that apartment building handled newspapers. There are so many lies in Watergate, and they're so easy to prove because there's been such great books written about them. But as I said earlier, these books are tomes. They're hard to get through. And I wanted to simplify Watergate as much as it could be simplified. And it's still somewhat complex because you've got a conspiracy within a conspiracy.
Okay. Well, have you done? Did you do a show with Danny Jones about about Watergate, about your book?
We focused mostly on Epstein and Diddy, but I believe that I did talk about Watergate too.
Okay. Listen, it's either way, it's a great movie.
Yeah. Well, it's a great movie. Unfortunately, it's all fiction.
Yeah, you're getting too tied down with the details there. You can't, you have to manipulate, you have to shape things a little bit. You only have 2 hours of screen time at most.
It is a great movie, and as a journalist, it shows what it's like pursuing a story. Unfortunately, it's all fiction. And Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein what cracked me up about them was they tell lies when they don't even need to tell lies. I didn't know what you'd call that, either a serial liar or a pathological liar. So I Googled serial liar and it came up as pathological liar. I'll give you some examples. Bernstein said that he drove to Virginia in this torrential downpour to talk to someone that was going to give him information. And there wasn't any rain that day.
Right.
The National Weather Service. And then he said that there was a subpoena that was going to be served on him. And then he ducked into an office and hung out and then went and watched Deep Throat while the subpoena server was going throughout the Washington Post building. That's bullshit too, because Deep Throat wasn't even playing. There was a bunch of litigation up here at that point, and Deep Throat wasn't even playing in Washington, D.C. So these guys that are probably the most famous journalists in the world, they're the reason why thousands of kids go to journalism school every year. They're pathological liars. And Ben Bradley was the CIA asset too. And I show that for sure in the book, that Ben Bradley was a CIA asset and he lied about being a CIA asset.
It's funny. It's like, the experience I have with that is kind of like, the movie War Dogs, where it's like, the true story is so much more interesting than this fiction that they put on screen. And I think a lot of, I actually wrote a book about a guy named Marcus Schrinker, who is a pathological liar. And it used to just kill me, like, why some of the lies he would tell. Like, this is a guy that had a beautiful wife. Well, let's start with, he owned a wealth management company that made good money. Lots of clients. His clients loved him. He was a professional pilot. He was a professional stunt pilot. He had a beautiful wife and 3 beautiful children. There is no reason to lie. You're a top tier individual. And yet it wasn't enough. He was constantly talking about when he flew missions in Iraqi freedom, or he was talking about he was in the first wave of the Afghani, when we invaded Afghanistan. It's like, you were never even in the military. Like, what I'm saying? It was like, you don't, like, why lie about that? You're already an amazing individual. But, these guys, I don't know what possesses them.
Chris Kyle. Now that was a very good movie made about Chris Kyle by Clint Eastwood. He's also a pathological liar.
And what was that movie?
He was the American assassin. I believe he was in Iraq or Afghanistan as a sniper. It's called American Sniper, the movie.
Oh, American Sniper. Okay.
And he's also a pathological liar. But this amazing movie has been made about him.
Right.
even though he's also a pathological liar.
Well, Catch Me If You Can. The movie Catch Me If You Can, Frank Abagnale. There are podcasts, there are books that are written about how his story is not completely fabricated, but the bulk of it is fabricated. And even when you watch the movie, I remember as a kid watching the movie when he goes into the bathroom to get away from the FBI and he goes through the toilet and then goes gets out of the aircraft in the wheel well. Like, I remember thinking, like, that's got to be sealed. Like, there's no, like, did he have tools with him? Did you have a blowtorch? Like, how did you get into the wheel well? It has to be, that entire aircraft has to be airtight. Like, how is that possible? And of course, you know, once the book came out, you find out, like, oh, that's not even possible. There's no way for him to have gotten from the fuselage into the wheel well where the you know, where the wheels come down. It's just not possible to do that. And, you know, and there's so many other things that are just complete fabrication. I don't just mean the movie, because the book is almost identical to the movie.
Well,
So
Watergate, it altered the trajectory of history, the history of the United States. It completely altered the trajectory, and that's why it needs to be revisited. And people need to know what Watergate was about. And the media has made it a good versus evil. The media has presented it as good versus evil, but actually it's a very complex tale. And it's a conspiracy within a conspiracy.
Hey, you guys, I appreciate you watching. Do me a favor, if you like the podcast, please send it to anybody that you think would be interested, share it, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button so you get notified of videos like this. Also, we're going to put all of Nick's links to his podcast. He's got a YouTube podcast. We're also going to put a link to his books and his website in the description box. So please check that out. Please go to his channel and subscribe. He's got some interesting stuff there. Also, please consider joining my Patreon. It's $10 a month. It really does help Colby and I make videos like this, and we do the uncensored version. There's probably going to be a lot of censored words here. So we do Patreon exclusive content and uncensored videos, and we place those on Patreon. $10 a month. Totally worth it. Really appreciate you guys watching. Thanks again. See ya.